Good morning, everyone. I'm today's moderator for the Weed, Pest, and Pathogens track. And my name is Rachel Peabody, and I'm our Director of Communications here at the Illinois Soybean Association. So welcome to this morning's agronomic track. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to mention that there will be one CEU in Integrated Pest Management available for attending this particular breakout. We will have details up on the screen at the end of this session on how to offer that and how to access your credit and get access to that CEU. We appreciate the opportunity to partner with our CCAs to add this additional benefit to our programming. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Mark Bernards, today's speaker, who will be presenting on what to do when we wait for the elusive silver bullet. Dr. Bernards is an associate professor in the School of Agriculture at Western Illinois University. He's earned his Ph.D. at Michigan State University and his master's and bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University. He previously worked as an extension weed specialist for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. At WIU, he teaches several classes in crop science, and he coaches the WIU Weed Science Team. Bernards directs agronomy operations at WIU's Agricultural Field Library, where he conducts research on weed management in both corn and soybeans, and he evaluates herbicides for crop safety and weed control efficacy. We're so excited he was able to join us today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Bernards.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm happy to be here today and grateful that you're willing to invest an hour of your time. I wish we could be in person. It's easy to get distracted when I'm in my office and trying to listen to a webinar, so I hope what I have to say today will be of use to you. So I was excited when I got my box from the Illinois Soybean Association with swag for this conference, and there was a poster from the Take Action group that's really been heavily promoted by the United Soybean Board. And so I hope all of you have taken the chance to pull these posters out and possibly hang them up someplace in your shop or office. They contain a tremendous amount of good information. I have them hanging in the classroom where I teach my weed science class. I'd like to take just a minute to put in a plug for Western Illinois University. My department is known as the School of Agriculture. And we offer programs in ag business, agronomy, animal science, ag education, horticulture. We have a new minor in precision agriculture that we're really excited about, and also urban forestry. The majority of our students really come from the western part of the state, but I'm always excited to see kids from different regions of the state, and they really add to the diversity of our student body. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm responsible for agronomy operations. We have 2 agronomy farms that are within 10 minutes of campus. So the main one is on the left part of the screen, and this is where I teach most of the labs for the crop science classes. And then the picture over on the right is our current agronomy farm. You can see here in the middle, we installed a tile drainage system a couple of years ago, and we've begun a project with the Illinois Nutrient Reduction and Education Cooperative, looking at different cropping systems and grazing integrated into those cropping systems and their impact on drainage. My research has primarily been industry supported. So in my 10 years here at Western, the Illinois Soybean Association has been a great sponsor of projects. So I'm grateful to all the members of those boards who have supported that. And then I've also received considerable funding from the major herbicide manufacturers. So full disclosure, my bias is towards herbicides. I think they're a tremendous tool for us. The driver weeds on the farm, and which will be represented in my thinking and some of the data that I show, are water hemp, which you can see in this figure on the left. I've got a really robust population in some areas, and we've documented at least 4 herbicide mechanisms of action that some of the patches on the farm are resistant to. Our other really challenging weed is mare's tail or horseweed over here on the right. And you can see in some of our fields we have robust populations of that too. The historic weeds on the farm going back for decades include cockleburr, shown here in the center, We have quite a bit of morning glory pressure, giant foxtail, and then our dominant winter annual weed is chickweed. A couple of years ago, the university built a new set of greenhouses designated for teaching and some research. And this has been a great benefit. Some of the data that I'll be sharing with you was generated by students. So we've got a picture here of a student that helped with the research project in the greenhouse. And then many of the students that work on these projects have had the opportunity to present them at meetings. You can see another student here sharing her poster at a North Central Weed Science Society meeting. And the real great thing about WIU is just the real hands-on learning curriculum that we have for our students. And having that farm within 10 minutes of campus has really enabled lots of great labs and lab activities. All right, so now to the topic that I've been really asked to talk about. So I thought about it, and I thought about my driving around the state. My observation is most Illinois farmers have relatively weed-free soybean fields at harvest. And I think this is really a witness to years of hard work on the part of many farmers and some pretty remarkable technologies that have been provided by industry. So I really reflected and thought, what can I share that will be of value? And my mind went back to the Bible. And in the creation story, when Adam and Eve are being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, God says the following, and I think it represents an ancient agrarian perspective on weeds. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return to the ground. So a couple things jumped out at me. I put up two pictures of weeds that I see on our farm. We've got spiny amaranth here in the top right, so that represents the thorns. And then down here I've got a Canada thistle. We have some patches of that. And as I thought about thorns and thistles, I thought, well, maybe water hemp isn't so bad. It's not as nasty to touch. Palmer amaranth would be a different story. The other thing that really struck out to me is the writer of the Bible viewed weeds as a lifelong battle. So they're going to cause us to eat of the ground and sorrow all the days of thy life, and we're going to have to sweat all of our lives. So I looked at this as job security. When I was picking the part of agronomy that I really wanted to focus on, I figured we're always going to have weeds. But I was intrigued as I read it in preparing this talk with this phrase, for thy sake. And so the question I'd like to pose is, what is it that we have to learn from weeds? And so as we go through this presentation, I'm going to provide some philosophical thoughts on that and then some practical thoughts. In my title, I use the term silver bullet, and I found a couple of definitions for it that I think are interesting. Merriam-Webster describes it as something that very quickly and easily solves a serious problem. A website based in the UK defined it as an action which cuts through complexity and provides an immediate solution to a problem, a miraculous fix, or like waving a magic wand. And perhaps the most famous culturally silver bullet had to do with the Lone Ranger. And the fact that he would ride in, save the scene, and often leave behind silver bullets. And if we go back in more ancient history, the term silver bullet really came up because people believed that was the only way to effectively kill a werewolf. All right, so we've always looked for solutions that make our life easier. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but in biology, it's not always easy. The next philosophical point I'd like to make is something that I've gleaned from reading Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So a lot of times in the agricultural community, we become a bit frustrated with this book because it started the environmental revolution, which I think provided some really good things for society, but it can also put pressure on some of the ways in which we practice agriculture. And a couple of quotes that have stood out to me, I'd like to read. So, and My context on this is I have all of my students in my integrated pest management read Silent Spring, and we talk about it as part of the class so that we can understand the perspective that the environmental movement really focuses on, since this is one of the seminal texts in their movement, but also so that my students can get a good sense of maybe some of the shortcomings of the arguments in there. But there are a couple of arguments that she makes that I think are pretty applicable. The first is single crop farming does not take the advantage of the principles by which nature works. It is agriculture as an engineer might conceive it to be. And if we think about the way that we farm, it's really based on engineering. We've got tractors that are built by engineers. We've got sprayers that are built by engineers. We're focusing on a single crop, and we do it because it's simple. Okay, with regard to spraying, she stated, the whole process of spraying seems to be caught up in an endless spiral. Thus, the chemical war is never won. And I think if we think about herbicide resistance in weeds, we are in the midst of this chemical war. We burned in the state of Illinois on water hemp through 3 or 4 herbicide modes of action in most fields. We've got 4 or so left to work with at this point. But as we've burned up one, we just seem to bring in another herbicide, and so it's that endless spiral. And then one of the great values of Silent Spring is it's a text that teaches applied ecology. And near the end of the book, Carson says, there are biological solutions based on understanding of the living organisms they seek to control and of the whole fabric of life to which these organisms belong. And as we move forward and wait for another silver bullet, I think we really need to keep in mind, how do we improve the biology of our systems so they're more resilient? So, summary of this philosophical point: a true silver bullet probably isn't reality, especially in biology. The reason why I state that is, can you think of an immediate solution that completely solved an agronomic challenge? All right, so herbicides would be an example. So yes, herbicides provided an immediate solution, but that solution was temporary. As we had resistance, we had other challenges. Fertilizer solved an agronomic challenge in terms of productivity. But as we've learned, fertilizer use can also have some side effects in the environment. So yeah, we can solve aspects of problems, but oftentimes in biology, we create other challenges for us to confront. Okay, but looking back, I wanted to talk about what are some of the giant leaps humans have made in weed management to kind of give us an appreciation for where we're at. Because if you recall, we were warned that weeds would require us to sweat and labor all the days of our lives. All right, so the earliest humans really were relegated to controlling unwanted plants through hand weeding. And it's something that's still done in the United States. This was a picture from several years ago in California, where workers were hand weeding a field. This is still the predominant way that weed management is done in many areas of Africa. And so here you see a group of African women hand weeding rice. I'd like you to think for just a moment, what are the health effects of bending over for hours and hours every day? It would be pretty profound. California even went so far as to regulate that workers couldn't hand weed. They had to use hose that allowed them to stand upright to prevent the spinal issues that came from bending over too much. If you think of educational opportunities, if I'm a child laborer and I have to go out and hand weed, and that's my primary way of weeding, that really limits my opportunities. And in my reading, there was one estimate that suggested if hand weeding in conjunction with tillage were the primary way that we controlled weeds in the United States, we'd have to have 70 million people working on farms. Okay, so this is clearly not the direction that we want to go. Early in agricultural history, we did not have domesticated livestock, and so the primary way of planting was with sticks, which is represented by this ancient art from Egypt. So you can see they've got sticks that they're poking holes and then sowing seed behind that. Early humans also came up with stone hoes, and that's represented by these two Egyptians here using hoes to remove weeds. And then I found a more modern picture where a woman's using a metal hoe, but it still has this very short handle, which ends up with the person being stooped over to remove weeds. Okay, I think this was a step forward from hand pulling the weeds. Can move a little bit faster, but still not desirable. We've also used fire historically to control weeds. We still do. So the picture on the left is of a slash and burn. So that's a way to remove unwanted vegetation and then come in and plant. Another method that I learned about is tapado. So this was used in the ancient Central America, where they would just chop the vegetation that was growing. They would sow their seeds underneath that vegetation, which created a nice moist environment. And then the weeds would come, or not the weeds, but the crops would come up, and this vegetation that they had chopped down would suppress the weeds. And if we think of planting green and rolling cover crops, really we're using a system that bears some similarities to that one. This is a picture from an Abraham Lincoln historic site. And to me, this would have been a monumental step forward, and that's simply a long-handled metal hoe. Okay, so I could weed a field pretty quickly and efficiently with a hoe without some of the negative health effects of bending over with short-handled hoes or the risks of fire. Right, plows date back almost as long as people have cultivated. Initially, people tried to pull sticks through the ground. So you'd have one person hooked to a stick and another person pulling to disrupt the surface vegetation. Sometime between 4,000 and 6,000 years before Christ, humans domesticated animals, and that's depicted here in this Egyptian art where they used oxen to pull wooden plows. In some places in the world, that sort of technique is still used here in the bottom. Plows, though, really gained some serious advancement in the 1700s in Europe. So quackgrass was a plant that was native to North America. It was transported back across as a contaminant and became a major weed in European agricultural systems. And the best way that they found to control it was by modifying the moldboard plow to where it really inverted the soil. So the plow here on the top is a picture of a plow from Monticello. So this was one that was used on Thomas Jefferson's plantation, and it was based on those European plows. In the 1830s, John Deere developed the steel plow that really revolutionized agriculture in the United States because it allowed us to tame the tall grass prairies of Illinois, and its effective way of cutting and turning the soil. So this was really a breakthrough in terms of weed management. Not only am I reducing human labor, substituting animal labor for that, but I've got much more efficient tools at destroying vegetation. With plowing, we tend to have a rough surface, so harrows have been important for smoothing out that surface, and spiked harrows for removing weeds. So if we go back to ancient Roman times, they just had a log pulled by horses or slaves to smooth their plow field. Okay, by medieval times, they had spikes on that. It was square, they pulled with horses. And then during the 1800s, there was really a revolution in tool development, and there were many adaptations to make these harrows that followed the Deere plow more efficient at smoothing the ground and controlling weeds that started to grow. Also in the 1800s, there were considerable advancements in INTERROW cultivators. This picture on the top right is of a horse-drawn INTERROW cultivator. So you'd have a horse in front of it and a man that would walk behind it, and several shanks that would dislodge or loosen the weeds. Okay, the challenge with this is if I'm walking behind the horse, I'm going to do 10 to 12 miles walking through that field to remove the weeds. Okay, so later designs, you were able to do a couple of rows and you were able to sit and be pulled by the horses. So that was another improvement. There was a thesis that was written by a student at Cornell that I used for some of this introduction. And in it, he quoted a writer, P.C. Johnson, who stated, "Virtually all inventors of farm machinery, later to become agribusiness industrialists, were blacksmiths or wheelwrights." And so this led me back to that question from Genesis, "For thy sake." So weeds throughout history have really caused humans to be innovative, to try and find better ways to solve them. So the question I'd like to ask you is, how are you innovating for the future? What ideas do you have for weed management? All right, but weeds really became much easier for humans to control with the advent of tractors. So the first tractors were introduced in the 1840s. They were steam tractors. They were enormous, typically between 10 and 20 tons. And they really didn't do a lot for weed control once I got into the season. The earliest gasoline tractors that were introduced in the 1890s were built on the same standpoint. And it was from this concept that we needed to be much more efficient in our agriculture, and so bigger was the way to go. And it changed agricultural economies. Prior to these large gas tractors, most everything in farm communities was done on cash or barter. But these large tractors, because they were so expensive, had credit purchase models. Usually over a 4-year period of time, you'd buy the tractors. Okay, but they caused compaction. They were difficult to work with. And so it was in 1916 when Ford introduced the Fordson tractor, shown here in the top right, and then in the 1920s with the Farmall tractors, that we had these smaller size tractors that were really suited for the acreages that farmers were farming. And in the 1930s, we had the introduction of the 3-point hitch and rubber tires on commercial tractors. And so all of a sudden, we go from walking behind horses and a tremendous amount of labor to being able to sit on a machine. And so it's much easier for me to till and to cultivate. So weed control is getting easier. Okay, and I think if you thought going from walking behind a horse to riding on a tractor would have probably felt a little bit like a silver bullet. All right, and so out of this time period, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was a tremendous amount of innovation in terms of cultivators. Some are mounted on the front, some are mounted on the back of your tractors. And I have an organic consultant that I have speak in one of my classes. And he really liked many of these cultivators from the 50s in particular. And I think we're probably just catching up to that technology with some of the newer cultivators that are coming out. Okay, but again, it made weed management easier. I could sit on the tractor, I could go fast, and I could cultivate or remove weeds from a lot more of my fields. Right, about the same time as we had this tractor revolution, herbicides were introduced. So in 1945, 2,4-D was made public. In 1946, about 600,000 pounds of it were used in the United States. In 1947, that increased almost 10 times to 5 million pounds. Okay, so farmers recognized this as a huge advance. By 1962, so within about 15 years, there were over 100 herbicide active ingredients being sold in the United States in 6,000 different formulations. So it was really a remarkable period in terms of innovation. The picture I have here in the middle of this slide is of a plot that we sprayed with 2,4-D on the WIU farm. And you can see there are very few broadleafs in here, so it did a fabulous job, but I really didn't get grass control. Okay, and Glenn Evans, who was the author of the dissertation that I talked about, stated, in some ways, herbicides represent the latest predominating power source on the farm. They provide a means by which to produce much more than before with greater levels of efficiency and with a reduction in manpower beyond what was previously thought possible. Okay, so these herbicides are really a step in that progress from human labor to animal labor to tractor labor to now we're using chemicals to really address our challenges. All right, so I'd like to argue that the first real silver bullet that was a herbicide was atrazine. So 1957 was when University Experiment Station saw the first atrazine trials. 1958, it was commercialized, so things happened a lot faster back in the 50s. And in 1960, it really facilitated the commercial adoption of no-tillage farming. And this newspaper clip that I show over here on the right is of a Harry Young field in western Kentucky, which was the first commercial no-till field. And the extension agent that was in that county, J. Reeves Davy, pointing out the furrow where the corn had been planted, and then some of the weeds that survived atrazine. But if you look at it, overall, atrazine did a phenomenal job burning down the vegetation in that field. Okay, and over the next few years, they learned that combining atrazine with paraquat improved weed control even better. This next slide is one that I think is really striking. So this is a picture that same trial where we had 2,4-D of atrazine. Okay, and with the exception of a little bit of large crabgrass that came up here in the front, it did a phenomenal job controlling weeds on this field that historically has had pretty high weed pressure. So if I were a farmer in the early 1960s and I sprayed this on my field, I'm guessing it must have felt a lot like what it felt to farmers who first tried the Roundup Ready system in the late 1990s. It was a tool that really did a fabulous job of controlling weeds and making management easier. Okay, and it was flexible because I had pre and post control, I had excellent broadleaf control, and I suppressed many grasses. All right, the next herbicide that I think would kind of be described as a wonder herbicide, maybe not a silver bullet, was Pursuit, or IMAZETHEPYR. So it got its registration for soybeans in 1989, and within 5 years it was applied on 75% of the soybean acres in Iowa. Okay, so just tremendous adoption, and it was because it provided excellent broadleaf and grass control in soybeans, which is something to that point had been pretty lacking. The Achilles heel of Pursuit, though, was water hemp, pictured in this slide on the right. Within that 6 or 7 year period, water hemp began to evolve resistance. And so when the Roundup Ready crops came along, people were ready for something new. Okay, so the Roundup Ready cropping system is probably the closest thing we've had to a true silver bullet. Early marketing suggested it would be the end of all other herbicides. There was the thinking in some quarters that we would never have resistance. It was really easy, it was really fast, and it was really effective. So the picture here on the right is of another one of those weed screens. You can see at a pound, glyphosate controlled everything except for the crop that was genetically engineered to withstand it. And we as an industry loved it. Within 10 years, about 90% of the soybeans planted had genetic engineered traits, specifically Roundup Ready. Okay, cotton, it's not quite as fast, and corn was a little bit slower, but both of those crops are now to the point where 80 to 90% of the germplasm that's planted is resistant to herbicides. So really revolutionary. Hey, and I think it was completely rational that we adopted it. So this is some data from studies that were done in Minnesota. And what they looked at was different application timings for glyphosate. And they compared that to some pre and post programs. Okay, so on this slide here on the left, you've got just a single pre is represented by this green dot. And so the yield in that field was about 35 bushels per acre. This blue dot represents 2 applications of glyphosate, a post followed by a post. Okay, and then this blue line represents pre followed by post. Okay, so early on, glyphosate by itself, 2 applications, was better by far than a pre followed by post in terms of yield. And then Dr. Gonzalez, as he looked at this data, he looked at returns, so how much money you made. And he contrasted that with the consistency as estimated by the standard errors here across the bottom. And you can see that these applications of 2 applications or 1 application of Roundup really were the most consistent and the most profitable. Okay, so we've got superb weed control. I can be flexible. Just 1 application here at 5-inch height was almost as good a yield as 2 applications. And so I think what we did made perfect economic sense in adopting the system and using it aggressively. All right, but biology doesn't always understand economics, and so we drove herbicide resistance. So if we look at today's offerings that the companies really want you to buy in the soybean germplasm market, we've got Enlist E3, we've got XtendFlex, and we've got LibertyLink GT27. What's the common denominator across all of these platforms? Okay, I'm sure you recognize it's glufosinate resistance or Liberty resistance. Okay, why? Number 1, Liberty quickly and simply solves an immediate problem, our definition for a silver bullet. In Illinois, we have pretty widespread glyphosate, ALS, PPO, and photosystem 2 resistance. HPPD resistance is becoming more widespread in both water hemp and Palmer amaranth, and glufosinate answers that. It's pretty effective on these weeds. Just like Roundup, it has excellent crop safety. It's pretty easy to apply. I don't have a lot of damage from off-target movement, and it has some benefits in facilitating conservation tillage. Okay, so I look at this, and I think we could say that we're in the middle of our next silver bullet. It's that Liberty system. Okay, but if weeds are for our sake, what are we to learn from it? About a decade ago, the Weed Science Society of America published a paper in which they proposed 12 best management practices to manage herbicide-resistant weeds. And I like to look at it more for a 12-step program to minimize our addiction to herbicides. Okay. Now, I love herbicides. As an undergraduate student, I did an internship one summer, and I remember spending 3 or 4 days hand-pulling weeds from a field where they were overgrown, and I determined at that point that I would always support the use of herbicides, which I still do. But I think we need to think beyond herbicides. All right, so if we look at glufosinate, how does it help us with this list? Just point number 6, which states, use multiple herbicide mechanisms of action that are effective against the most troublesome weeds or those most prone to herbicide resistance. All right, so with glufosinate, we have a herbicide mode of action that we haven't used widely. It is effective against our most troublesome weeds, okay? And especially those weeds, water hemp and Palmer amaranth, and mare's tail that have a lot of issues with herbicide resistance. All right, but if we just use glufosinate, it's going to suffer the same fate as our other herbicides have. So how can we help glufosinate? How can we help this latest silver bullet in our armor clip of bullets really last as long as we can make it last? So there are 4 things on this list that I think are pretty straightforward, and I've got some data slides to support them. Number 3 is to plant into weed-free fields and then keep fields as weed-free as possible. Okay? I think most farmers in Illinois are pretty focused on that. I don't see fields being planted that are weedy. We try to manage the weeds in our fields pretty effectively. Okay, number 4 is plant weed-free crop seed. We do a great job of that. The seed that we get from seed supplies, especially in corn and soybean, are really clean. If we're getting other seed, particularly for CRP or pasture planting, we need to be a little bit more critical of that. Scout fields routinely, and this is really to target escapes so we can make sure that we come back and keep track of what's going in our field. And number 7 is to apply the labeled herbicide rate at recommended weed sizes. Okay, and 7 is where I'm going to focus some of my comments here. So glufosinate is not glyphosate. It is a great herbicide, but it's probably not as, well, there's no probably about it. It's not as forgiving of different conditions as what glyphosate or Roundup is. All right, so a number of years ago, Brigham Young gave some presentations in which he said your index finger is how you should measure your weed height. Most of the time, your index finger is about 3.5 inches. And so if those weeds are less than that index finger, it's probably the right size for glufosinate. So in this data on the right, I applied glufosinate to some 8-inch, so water hemp and velvet leaf. Okay, and I looked at Liberty by itself here in this purple, and with the cut rate of Liberty, I only got about 40% control of water hemp and 40% control of velvet leaf. Okay, so small weeds is really important. Full rates is really important. We really need those weeds to be actively growing. So glufosinate products, Liberty being the most famous one, really work best when there's abundant soil moisture and those weeds are actively growing. Okay, we can try and accommodate for more adverse conditions by increasing our gallons of water. So 15 gallons is the minimum. 20 gallons per acre is really better in terms of weed control. And AMS is absolutely critical with glufosinate. The label recommends 3 pounds per acre. This particular study that I have some data from here, we looked at water conditioners. So this would be an AMS replacement. You can see with water hemp, it didn't do much. With velvet leaf, it did a little. Okay, but when I looked at AMS, particularly on velvet leaf, that full 3 pounds per acre pushed my control to nearly 100%, even with a half rate of glufosinate. Okay, so using Liberty correctly is going to be key for making that effective in our systems. Okay, Liberty or glufosinate works best following pre's. So I have two different studies here from the WIU farm conducted in 2020, where I tried to use just Liberty by itself on water hemp. I really struggled, and I think it had to do with environmental conditions. So this was a single post application. Weeds were between 4 and 8 inches where there hadn't been a pre, but you can see where I had a pre, I had near 100% control in those plots. Okay, and in this particular year, Liberty was a little weaker on water hemp than it was on the other weeds in the study. In a separate study where I was looking at the Enlist system, I looked at applications of just in Liberty plus Enlist 1 applied really early post. So the idea was I don't get a pre on, I come in early post and try and clean it up. Okay, well, what I saw was pretty poor control. Okay, so of water hemp, when I came back several weeks later, it was about a little over 50%. Giant foxtail, it was closer to 80. Some of this was regrowth of weeds that didn't fully die, and some of it was weeds that were germinating in the soil after we had a rain. Okay, I also tried to mix this Liberty Enlist system with just a residual herbicide, so a one-pass early post program. Okay, and you can see it was somewhat better, but really not acceptable on water hemp or foxtail. Okay, if I want the glufosinate molecule to work, it has to follow a good pre-emergence herbicide program. Okay, how do I use glufosinate in sequential applications? So I can tank mix glufosinate with Enlist 1 for post, and I think that's the best strategy because I've got 2 effective modes of action. Okay, if I do this, I still probably want to, if I don't have a pre-down, I need to use sequential, so 2 applications of that system. But again, my recommendation is a good pre first. However, with the XtendiMax or in the XtendFlex soybean, I can't tank mix glufosinate with either XtendiMax or Ingenia, and that's from a volatility management standpoint. The glufosinate causes more of that dicamba to go up into the atmosphere. And so one of the studies that we've looked at for a couple years is it better to spray glufosinate first, or is it better to spray my auxin herbicide first? Okay, and from a volatility standpoint, we want to put the auxin down first. And in terms of weed control, that seemed to work better in our plots too. So where I sprayed the auxin mimic here on the right at my 21-day rating, I had about 100% control of water hemp. Where I sprayed the glufosinate, it was about 95. Okay, not a large difference, but I think we're really better off in these sequential programs to make sure you get that extend out early, and we can use glufosinate to come back and clean up if needed. Okay, if we look at the interval between those applications, should I spray my glufosinate 2 weeks after the auxin or 3 weeks after the auxin? I think either answer is acceptable. At the 21-day rating, we had pretty even weed control. By 28-day rating. That 3-week interval looked a little bit better for spraying the glufosinate second. Okay, but anytime between 2 and 3 weeks, I think, is appropriate. In 2 weeks, you're probably going to get better coverage of the weeds because if you have to come back, the canopy won't be as dense. All right, if I'm just using glufosinate, I don't want to use Enlist or 2,4-D, and I don't want to use the XtendiMax or Ingenia or Tavium. How many days should I wait between glufosinate applications? Okay, so in this particular study, we looked at 0 days. So it was conducted in 19 and 20. A single application in 19 gave us a little bit better control than a single application in 2020. Then we looked at a 4-day interval. We looked at a 7, a 14, and a 21. And my conclusion is that in Illinois, 14 days between glufosinate applications is probably going to give us our optimum weed control in most situations, at least on the pigweed species. Okay, so if I start with a pre and I come back with glufosinate and I need another post, I probably want to come back about 14 days later. Okay, this was a study that was conducted with no pre's, so this would be a post-only program. So if you're going to choose a post-only problem, then that 14-day interval would be what I think would probably be optimum in our environment. Okay, but again, I really think glufosinate is best served to have a good pre-down first. All right, I'd like to make one comment on dicamba because this is an important part of our weed management portfolio right now. We've had the opportunity to conduct hoop studies on behalf of Bayer and Monsanto for the last 4 years, I think it is. And so what we do out in the field is we set up these plastic tents, and in the center of those tents we put down a tray that's been treated with different combinations of dicamba and drift retardant adjuvants and other tank mix herbicides. And we'll come back 2 weeks later, and usually there's been some movement one direction or another in that tent, and we can see damage on the soybeans. And so we take damage ratings every foot, and so 10 feet would represent the edge of the plot from the center, and then usually we'll go out about 15 feet beyond it. In my experience is we rarely see damage much more than 2 or 3 feet past the edge of this tent, because it gets mixing in the atmosphere and it's able to move away and not damage beans. Okay, so on this at 2 feet, if you look at the current labels for dicamba, it requires us to add a tank mix volatility agent. So I have it listed here as extra vapor grip. So where I didn't have extra vapor grip at 2 feet, I had about 30% damage or injury to those soybeans. That was cut by the extra vapor grip to 15. Okay, at 6 feet, I still had almost 30% damage, and it dropped to about 10% with the extra vapor grip. By the time you got to the edge of the tent, it went from 20% in severe cases down to less than 5. Okay, and this was the trial where I saw more injury. I had another trial where I added the extra vapor grip, and I didn't see much of any injury. And so in WIU studies, adding this tank mix vapor grip reduced volatility 50 to 95%. I communicated a little bit with Brigham Young at Purdue, and they saw about a 50% reduction. So I think it's absolutely critically important with this technology that we follow the label and we put that extra vapor grip in. At the Weed Science Society meetings, there was also an interesting study out of Missouri, and they found that we really want winds between 3 and 10 miles per hour as we do spraying, because that will really allow the herbicides to dissipate. You get a lot more damage to surrounding crops when we spray and conditions are calm, either before or after that spray. All right, next thing that we can do pretty easily is to scout for survivors. Why do we want to do this? It's because survivors produce seed. We've done studies at WIU in the greenhouse and out in the field where we sprayed water hemp with sublethal doses. Okay, so a typical dose of XtendiMax would be 560 grams per hectare on the metric scale. Okay, and when we sprayed plants early in the season that were similar in size to the soybeans, we had pretty poor mortality. Okay, even though we had high injury. When we sprayed later and the weeds were a lot smaller, we had higher mortality and injury. But the important thing that we saw is these plants that survived and were in the middle, so where they got enough sunlight and they weren't shaded out by the crop to survive, they produced seed. So if we're not going out and scouting and recognizing that we've got survivors that we need to take care of, we're going to add seeds back to the seed bank. And it's been pretty well documented in a number of species that if we get plants that get these sublethal or not high enough doses, like cutting rates, even if we aren't cutting rates, there are weeds that just don't get the full dose, that we select for resistance. So scouting is something that we absolutely have to do if we're going to protect this glufosinate molecule. All right, so how can we help glufosinate with extra management and as we look to future tools? So number one, we need to understand the biology of the weeds present. 2, we've got to use a diversified approach focused on preventing weed seed production and reducing the number of weed seeds in the soil seed bank. Number 8, use cultural practices that suppress weeds by using crop competitiveness. 9, use mechanical and biological management practices where appropriate. 10, prevent field-to-field and within-field movement of weed seed or vegetative propagules. 11, manage weed seed at harvest and after harvest to prevent a buildup of the weed seed bank. Okay, so we're really going to focus pretty heavily on managing weed seed banks. Okay, so first I came to Illinois really as a cover crop skeptic. I had done a lot of work at the University of Nebraska where we looked at winter annual weeds, and then when I came here I did some work with cover crops, and when I compared a system where we had a fall burn down, or we kept that field weed free, and then I compared a system where we planted green, I almost always saw a reduction in my cash crop yield. Okay, the last few years as I've done these studies, I have not seen as big a reduction, so I don't know if we're figuring out how to use the system better. But we have experienced some real benefits from cover crops. Number 1, the weed suppression effects are real. Number 2, we tend to find that our soil is a lot more mellow in the spring, and we have seen protection on our farm against soil erosion. Okay, and we know it protects against nitrogen loss, which is a huge deal for ag. How do cover crops help? This is data from a study that was funded by the Illinois Soybean Association and a poster that was presented by a student. We looked at 3 timings of cover crop control: 2 weeks before planting, at the time of planting in the yellow, and 2 weeks after planting. And we did weed counts and we did weed biomass. I'm never going to recommend leaving your cover crop out there 2 weeks after planting. It's not good for yields. Okay, but at that 0 weeks after planting, or planting green and terminating on the same day, we didn't see a big impact on weed counts. But 4 weeks after planting, we saw a huge impact on weed biomass. Okay, and so my takeaway is these cover crops really result in smaller, easier to control weeds for post-application. Okay, and if I combine that cover crop with a good residual herbicide, and I get good rainfall to activate that residual herbicide, I can have a really close to weed-free field when I come back with my post-emergence herbicide, so I can have a weed-free field at harvest. Okay, more cover crop biomass usually results in less weed biomass. That's why we saw the benefit for waiting 2 weeks after planting, but that came at a yield expense. We lost yield. However, in just our planting green, we didn't see any difference between 2 weeks before and controlling our weeds at planting. This picture over here on the right is one that I really like. We've got henbit on the right and a cover crop on the left. And you can see this cover crop just really suppressed the amount of henbit biomass that was out there. And when we suppress biomass, we suppress weed seed production. All right, planting date and row spacing, I think, are tools. This figure on the left is data from the University of Wisconsin. And they found that if I delay my planting, especially if I've got a field with pretty aggressive weeds, that I'm going to have a lot fewer weeds at the end of that year if I'm in a post-only program. Okay, if I put an effective pre-down, there's not as much benefit for delaying planting. Okay, I recognize there are yield loss with this, but as a weed management tool, it's something that we need to keep in our toolbox. Narrowing row spacing, and I understand there are economic challenges for having 2 planters when 1 planter can cover all your acres. But in Liberty soybeans, and this is data specific to Liberty soybeans, they saw a 10% increase in weed control in Liberty-only applications as they narrowed from 30 to 15 inch. Okay, so anything we can do to get that crop to canopy sooner is going to help the Liberty molecule, and it will help any of our herbicides. I think it would be prudent for us if we have a field that we sprayed once or twice with glufosinate and we had escapes to go out and remove those plants. Okay, we eliminate weed seed return, we eliminate that drive towards resistance. Another really important tool is to clean our combines and not harvest weed patches. University of Wisconsin Weed Science program has done a seminar and a series the last couple of years in which they've gone out and they've collected weed seed from farmers' combines, and they found that almost 80% of it is either stuck in the head or the feeder house. Okay, so if you've got a field where you've had weeds in it, before you move to the next fields, clean out your combine head and your feeder house, and hopefully you'll reduce weed seed spread. There's another really terrific study out of the University of Arkansas where they had one Palmer amaranth plant escape, and they ran that through the combine for 3 years, and within that 3-year period, the entire 1 acre field was infested. Okay, so if you've got a patch of weeds, it may be worth just leaving it out there rather than spreading it through your entire field. All right, what are some future technologies? University of Missouri, Kevin Bradley's program has done some interesting things with weed electrocution. This only works if I've got a weed disaster and my weeds have escaped herbicides and they're taller than my soybeans. But you drive this thing through the field, it's got a generator on the back that produces up to 110,000 watts and transmits 15,000 volts, and it does a pretty effective job at frying the weeds. Okay, Kevin Bradley said it's completely opposite of herbicides. You want to have big weeds, and if those weeds have started reproduction, so they're flowering and setting seed, you get even better control. Okay, perhaps a less dangerous and exciting thing is the see and spray concept. This will still rely on us to use pre-herbicides, but you'll have sprayers with cameras that will sense weeds and target that. There's a lot of interest in drone sprayers, and I think drones could be a pretty effective tool in the future at this see and spray where they would go out and target our escapes. Okay, steps that are going to make weed control simpler and easier. Things that we could do right away that have been shown to have a pretty effective impact on weed seeds is chaff lining. So this is where you concentrate all of the chaff that includes most of the weed seeds in a combine in a narrow band. And what they found is that with water hemp and Palmer amaranth, you can accumulate about 90% of the seed that passes through the combine, which is usually between 70 and 80%. And the weeds that end up in that chaff line, or the seeds that end up in that chaff line, have a much lower chance of germination. It's reduced 80 to 90%. Okay, so I concentrate all my weeds in a band. They get eaten by insects and rodents out in the field, and they just degrade because there's lots of organic matter around them, and it makes future weed control easier. A little bit more expensive option is a weed seed destructor. So you've probably heard of these. They are commercialized, but they are mounted on the back of the combine, and you have a mill system, and as the weed seeds run through this, they get smashed, and they found, similar to that chaff lining, that you reduce germination 80 to 90%. Okay, these are not silver bullets. They are tools. They found with water hemp that you lose about 1/3 of your seeds at the header, so we're just getting rid of 2/3 of the seeds. But it is enough that we reduce weed seed return and we make that future management easier. All right, further out into the future, we'll have weed control robots. So the University of Illinois has a program that's working on this, where they will go through the field, they'll have cameras, and they'll use those cameras to identify weeds, and then there will probably be knives or hose or little sprayers that will control those weeds. So that will be pretty exciting, and will be another way that we're able to reduce the workload of humans due to weeds. Okay, the final one I'd like to kind of focus on is the concept of regenerative ag. So this is, again, not going to be something that we'll use everywhere, but it's based on a no-tillage system, the extensive use of cover crops where you armor that soil and you have living roots at all time, and you're really trying to increase the diversity of your system beyond corn and soybeans. And a key part of regenerative ag is grazing. And this diversity in terms of crops on the soil surface really sets back weeds. And some people have been able to be pretty profitable with this, particularly as they direct market their grain and meat to consumers. Okay, so this is a tool that I think we need to think about because it integrates a lot more biology. All right, are new herbicides coming? Yes. FMC has announced 2 new herbicide modes of action, at least new to the rice and the corn systems. BASF and Bayer are looking at new PPO herbicides with trait packages. These PPO herbicides have some effectiveness on PPO-resistant weeds. And then Bayer has reported that they found a new herbicide mode of action. Challenge with this is it's 8 to 12 years from discovery to commercialization. So the earliest we'll probably see any of these products will be in the late 2020s if everything goes well and they don't run into issues in the meantime that cause them to not commercialize that. Okay, so we are really looking at a period of 8 to 10 years where we're going to be working with the tools that we have in our tool belt right now. All right, so for thy sake, what is it that we have to learn from weeds? Okay, number one, weeds mean we'll never stop working. We're always going to have them in our fields. I think our goal has to be to minimize the number so that it's less work. Number two, I hope you see as we went through this talk that humans have done some innovating pretty continuously over all of recorded history. And we've made some fabulous strides, especially in the last 70 years. Okay, but I think we need lots more ideas. So what are your ideas for new tactics? I encourage you to reach out to me or to other weed scientists at universities or in the industry and propose those. Some of our greatest technologies have really been ground up from the farmer. Number three, weeds are biology. I think long term we need a lot more than engineering and chemistry to manage them. Engineering and chemistry will make it easier, but we always have to remember that every engineering solution or chemical solution that we introduce, nature is going to come up with a biological counter argument, and so biology has to be part of that system. All right, thank you for your attention. I really hope you've gotten out of this, and I think we're ready for a Q&A session.
Hi, everyone. So at this point, we're going to begin taking questions from the audience. So if you've got a question, please use the Ask a Question function in the sidebar on the left side of your screen. And we've already got a couple that came in, Dr. Bernard's. Number 4, or thinking out of the box, what are your thoughts on encouraging post-harvest growth of summer annuals going into winter, such as light tillage or light UAN application?
Okay, I think that's a great question. So the idea there would be I till and I maybe stimulate that seed bank. The challenge that we have is that as many of our weed seeds go through the summer cycle, they enter into a secondary type dormancy or quiescence. And so with those shorter days, they may be less likely to germinate. So our ability to deplete the weed seed bank at that time is probably somewhat limited. I do think that if you come back in and use that tillage and it causes your corn to grow, or we found great luck, we came back and we planted oats afterwards, it really mellowed out that soil, and there was a bit of residue that helped us with our weed management in the spring. Okay, so I'm not opposed to that. I think there are some biological limitations to that particular approach.
Next question, what are your thoughts on glufosinate plus residual prior to a group 4 product? My thought is to use the contact killer while the canopy is open and the systemic when coverage is difficult to achieve, plus provide overlapping residuals in doing so. What are your thoughts on that process?
Good, that's an interesting idea too. Based on my data that I've shown, I guess I'm more comfortable with a group 4 herbicide before glufosinate. There wasn't a large difference in control. We had 5 to 10% difference in terms of percentage. But my other reason for putting that systemic first is I found in my research where I put down a group 4 herbicide and I have it tank mixed with the residual, that I really improve the residual control that I get from that residual herbicide. In some cases, it's been a large numeric difference. In nearly all cases, I see a tightening, so I see much more consistency across my trials. So I think the logic is sound. I think there's good reason to do glufosinate first with a residual and then follow with the group 4. But from a volatility standpoint and from really capturing what I see as almost a between the group 4 and residual herbicides, I would still recommend doing that first and following up with the glufosinate.
All right, we've got time for one more question. So your last question, what is your recommendation for the best weed fighting strategy if you're growing non-GMO soybeans this year?
Best weed fighting strategy for non-GMO soybeans would be to start clean, to put down a full residual herbicide, and then to come back within 3 to 4 weeks with a post herbicide that's effective on the weed spectrum in that field. I really think weed management needs to be field specific. So every field has different weeds in it, and so I can't give you a specific herbicide recommendation, but if you're non-GMO soybeans and you want to rely on herbicides for that control, that would be my approach. And if you could incorporate a cover crop into a non-GMO system, I think that really gives you an added benefit, because that cover crop is going to give you a lot of suppression to those early emerging weeds and make it easier for the herbicides that you do have in your portfolio to control them.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Bernards, on behalf of ISA and all the growers and CCAs that we've got on the line this morning, thank you so much for joining us as part of Soybean Summit this year. As you guys can see on the screen, if you're a CCA, don't forget to claim your 1 CEU credit in integrated pest management by scanning the QR code you see. You can either scan this QR code, or you can also email our team here at ISA with your CCA number by Friday, and we'll make sure we get you submitted for credit. We'll leave this this QR code up for a few minutes so you have the opportunity to get it scanned. And again, thank you, Dr. Bernards, for joining us today. Excellent presentation, and we really appreciate everyone who joined us this year for our 2021 Virtual Soybean Summit. Have a great day.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.